So I'm Sarah, this is my colleague Michael, and as you say, we work in the International Inequalities Institute, specifically in the Wealth Elites and Tax Justice team. And we're interested in how wealth inequality is communicated in the media and by campaigning organisations, and how it's understood by the public. So our work takes place in a context of high levels of wealth inequality, relatively high levels of public concern about wealth inequality, but low levels of support for redistribution, and we're interested in why that is and what the role of communications is in that dynamic. And our work also takes place in the context of the US election result and our recent election and the budget that just happened. An analysis of both events is drawing attention to the lack of engagement of the left with issues of economic inequality. So Rachel Reeves didn't mention inequality once in her budget speech, and the Democrats are being accused by those on the left of their own party of neglecting economic arguments in their own campaigning. And in the absence of these strong narratives from the left, populist frames tend to dominate, in which the problem of economic hardship is posed of one, for example, of immigrants stealing American jobs, rather than billionaires extracting wealth through a low-wage economy. So our research asks whether and how the way that wealth inequality in particular is talked about contributes to this lack of support for redistribution. And we work towards proposing ways of talking about it that could instead increase support. So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about the design of the project and a literature review that we carried out, and then I'm going to hand over Michael, who'll talk you through some workshops that we ran and some testing that we did with citizen focus groups. So LSE's original founding vision was, at the end of the 19th century, was about knowing the cause of things for the betterment of society. And one way of expediting the effect of research on the betterment of society is to design your research in dialogue with people who actually want to know about it and who are intent on making that social change. So lots of our LSE colleagues do that, and in the Inequalities Institute we do that too. So our partner is Joseph Rowntree Foundation. They're a UK-based anti-poverty campaigning organisation, but they're shifting their focus to thinking about the role of wealth in social harm, and they want to be able to talk about wealth in a more critically engaged way. So that's the challenge that they're trying to address. And it's useful for them to know how people currently talk about it and what the barriers are to it gaining traction. So in order to deliver this, we're doing different kinds of research, and some of it is quite traditional academic research, so the literature review, and some of it is less traditional, and that's the report that I'm going to be talking about, where we've looked at the literature review and then effectively interpreted it for our partner to pull out the bits of that are pertinent to their work on framing. And at the end of it, we'll produce a guidance that they've asked us to produce, which gives them some language and some images to use when they're talking about wealth inequality. So this is the literature review. It's available online, and it was a thematic review in two parts with these 4 questions. So I'm not going to unpack the 65 pages of literature review that's online, but these are the key questions that we looked at. And then out of that, this was the report that we wrote. So I'm going to talk through 6 of the key findings from the report and how they relate to JRF's interest in framing. So first of all, the literature found a lack of a settled public understanding, not just about wealth inequality, but about wealth. So people are quite supportive of even high levels of wealth inequality. They see it as aspirational, and on the other hand, they're also aware that it can cause social and environmental harm. So because there's no settled understanding, in terms of narrative change organisations, that's an opportunity. It creates a space where we can intervene actively to propose alternative ways of talking about it. So there is an opportunity for increased public understanding, and that could play a role in converting those high levels of concern about inequality into support for change. But what the literature review found, which is relevant for JRF, is that information doesn't always play the role we want it to play. So some of the research showed that even showing people the true facts about the state of wealth inequality can make them less supportive of redistribution, because it increases their mistrust of government. They think, well, if the government's let it get into this state, why should we support them, and why should we believe that they can do anything about it? So information on its own doesn't always play the role we want it to play in making change. So although 72% of people in the UK believe inequality is too high, 72% of people don't support redistribution. So the other key finding of the report that's relevant for JRF is the role of existing beliefs and primarily meritocracy. So meritocracy beliefs are such that people look at effort and talent and link that to economic outcome at both ends of the spectrum. So if you're not doing well, but you've tried hard and worked hard, people see that as fair in the same way that they see it as fair that you're doing really well at the other end, because they believe that the status quo is as it should be. So it's versions of belief in a just world, and these are found in the literature to exert a brake on translating high levels of concern into support for action. So this is one of the things that Michael will pick up on in the conversation he tells you about that we held with our focus groups. And this explains what Trump calls, and I'm just clarifying here, this is Christella Trump, not Donald, though if he thinks this would be quite the research revelation, but she calls it the adjustment hypothesis. So what we might expect to see in a democracy is, as inequality increases, we might expect to see more public anger tracking that increase in inequality. And instead what happens is people adjust their perceptions of what's fair. So as inequality increases, meritocracy beliefs increase and public concern and support for redistribution decrease. So that's a key factor for us to bear in mind when we're proposing new framing. Brilliant. The other thing that the literature flagged was the risk of subsuming wealth inequality into a tax justice agenda. So although there is a space for tax justice framing, it's more important from a social justice perspective to acknowledge the social justice impacts of wealth inequality. And looking at tax solutions can hide pre-distribution issues and upstream questions of why the wealth distribution looks like this in the first place. It can mask those and just end up with a discourse that's around technical solutions through tax. And JRF is interested in the link between wealth inequality and social harm, so they want a richer set of tools to talk about it with, not just tax justice tools. We also found, and this is perhaps unsurprising, that the media tends to legitimise wealth inequality and offer reformist and not radical solutions. So the frames used in the media tend to be individualist frames where people are held accountable and responsible for their own outcomes, and structural factors are downplayed. So you've got, on the one hand, at the bottom, you've got the narratives of shirkers and skivers, and at the top, narratives of self-made billionaires, however improbable that might seem. And then finally, different frames do shape the understanding and response to economic inequality. So because high levels of economic inequality are something we don't necessarily see in our daily lives, we tend to live in more income homogenous areas where we're not exposed to these high levels. We tend to find out about them by being told about them, and this means we find out about them via a frame. And the literature does show that frames have a significant effect on opinions, not just opinions, but perceptions about wealth inequality, and then opinions about it. All those aspects of framing that I talked about at the beginning, so problem definition, causation, moral judgment, and solutions, frames can have a significant impact on that. So this process that we've been through of reviewing and then reflecting on the literature review in the light of the challenges that our partner articulated to us has shaped our intuition about what kind of frames might work best in this context. And Michael is now going to tell us about the next stage of the work we did.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Is this microphone working now? Okay, great. So yes, you've heard from Sarah about the first couple of stages of this project, which was really about mapping out what we know already about the role that the media plays in the politics of wealth inequality. But because of our partnership with this social change organisation, we wanted to go a step further than that and to try and see if we could generate new ways of talking about wealth and wealth inequality through the media that could more proactively and more pro-socially maybe shape these kind of discussions. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. And the first stage of that was running a set of expert convenings earlier this year. So that was 4 workshops with civil society organisations, with journalists, academics and activists. And we asked questions, different aspects of this topic, questions like what are the different ways to understand wealth? what are the wider narratives, like meritocracy, that matter for these kind of politics, and a particular interest in the role of images in data visualization, which we're not going to have time to get into today, but happy to talk about in the Q&A. And so I want to draw out a couple of the main insights that came out of those workshop discussions. One of the biggest questions that we focused on, building off what Sarah mentioned earlier about the lack of settled public understanding about what wealth is, we talked in these workshops about what are the different ways that we could talk about wealth that would allow us to problematize it more effectively through the media. Because we know that there are these complex mix of positive and negative associations that people have. And so we came up with a couple of these different angles where we could talk about wealth that might be productive. One, probably the most intuitively obvious, is amounts. So is there an amount of wealth where it becomes a social problem? So can we differentiate, for example, between an ordinary amount of wealth that everyone needs to flourish, savings in the bank, a secure home, and then a point at which the amount of wealth you have becomes extreme, and that starts to become harmful for society in some way. So this really ties into the active discussion at the moment, that some of you might know about libertarianism, that Ingrid Robains has written most prominently about, that suggests there's a level above which people should not, and maybe should not even be allowed, to hold more wealth. Apart from amounts though, there are actually related but different ways to think about the problems of wealth and wealth concentration. Another one is sources. Does it matter where wealth comes from? So in economics and in taxation, there's a very clear difference between money that comes from labour and money that comes from capital. But that's actually a socially important difference as well, that people have very different views of the fairness and the merit of wealth that is earned versus unearned. And so back to Adam Smith and many others, there's a kind of ingrained skepticism of landlords and the rentier class. We can also think about the uses that wealth is put to. So historically, people have given a lot of leeway to very wealthy people if they use that wealth well. So think about philanthropists, or the role that the very rich have played as saviours of last resort of the economy or society in times of crisis. So people are likely to view that kind of wealth holder and wealth as much more positively than wealth that is parked in a tax haven offshore, for example. And finally, we can think about the difference that ownership might make. This was a very prominent theme in these convenings, that does it make a difference if we think about public wealth, community wealth, the commons, versus more individualistic, privately hoarded wealth. So we had these set of different possible ideas that came out of our expert convenings, but the last stage that we're going to talk about today is we tested how some of these ideas and concepts travelled out into the wild when we facilitated discussions with citizens, 4 different groups in London and York over the past couple of months. And again, I'm just going to draw out a couple of the most interesting insights that connect to the discussions I've talked about in the previous slide. And the first, thinking about these different ways of problematizing wealth from the last slide, people in our citizen focus groups much more readily evaluated fairness of uses and sources of wealth than amounts just by themselves. So I'm going to bring a couple of the quotes because I think these illustrate really richly what I mean by that. So one participant said, if I create Amazon and millions of jobs, can you say I have too much money? Another person said, you could be wealthy and help others and help charities, or you could try and get away without paying taxes. So it became very clear in these discussions that people are used to scrutinizing and evaluating individual very wealthy people in terms of these questions of the sources and uses of wealth that make the isolated question of amount a little more complicated to carry in isolation. Another thing that, and I should note that this is actually probably a different focus than in the economics literature, which is very focused on pure amounts. Another difference that we noticed from maybe the scholarly discussion around inequality levels is that people were very motivated to talk about the concrete ways that wealth and wealth inequality entered their lives. So nowhere was this more obvious than thinking about housing, which was a real lightning rod for people's feelings and people's understandings about wealth and wealth inequality. So again, a couple of quotes. One participant: "The level of rich I see in London is higher than in Manchester because of the house prices. The inequality shocks me." So here it's bringing in this idea of regional inequality. Another participant: "It's harder to accumulate wealth now. I can't imagine being able to afford a house." And here it brings in a generational inequality dimension. So it's through housing that people most energetically dramatised and personalised the stakes of wealth inequality, and actually brought themselves that language of inequality into the discussion. So I want to have one last slide on these focus group results and think about what does this mean in terms of the broader politics, the sort of so what of the wealth inequality question. Because at one level, our focus groups vindicated the impression Sarah talked about from the literature review, that there is a broad shared impression about high and rising inequality. So this kind of quote was illustrative of the general sentiment. There's more of a divide, the rich have got richer, and the poor have got poorer. And in a sense, this impression that was shared across our focus groups of high and rising inequality is maybe stronger and clearer than in the academic literature, where it kind of depends on the measure that you use and the time frame that you're looking at, but maybe inequality is stable, maybe it's gone up, maybe it's gone down. So in our focus groups, that impression of high and rising inequality was very clear. But equally strong and shared was this pessimism about politics and the possibility for change, which did very much acted as a circuit breaker for translating that concern into support for change or faith that change was possible. So one participant said, if you put taxes up, won't the rich people move abroad? This reproduction of the fear of capital flight, which is something that I'm sure we all have lots of examples in our mind that this is a narrative that is tended very assiduously in the media, as we've seen in politics around the non-dom tax reforms recently. And more broadly than that specific policy concern, this idea, money is power, this will never change, as one participant said, that this kind of fatalism about the interrelationships between wealth concentration and the concentration of power was a real problem in terms of people talking about the possibility for change. So in the 30 seconds or so I've left to wrap up some concluding thoughts and linking back to the question of this session, can the media change our beliefs about wealth inequality? The first point really that we would make is the media already shapes our beliefs about wealth inequality, what we understand about its levels, how we evaluate it, how we situate it in narratives like meritocracy, as Sarah was saying earlier. But the argument that we want to make through this project and that we'll hopefully contribute to in some way is that we can work to create new ways of shaping beliefs about wealth inequality through the media. For example, focusing on how wealth is accumulated and used, perhaps in connection to the amounts and the levels of inequality that we observe. If we connect it to concrete ways that wealth shapes people's lives, like in housing, and importantly, by addressing this hope deficit, that we can't just talk about the problem of wealth inequality without making real for people the possibility of solutions. Thanks for your time.